So first of all, in terms of this photograph, obviously it's potentially quite a compromising situation for you, and it's obviously quite understandable why you wouldn't want that to get out to anyone. So what we really need to probably first get an idea of is what, first of all, who's doing this and actually what they necessarily are going to do with it.
And in some respects, that's obviously information that's quite up in the air right now, and we can't provide those instant answers of who sent it and whatnot. The really important thing is sometimes the hardest thing to hear, which is this isn't a situation that we can guarantee control of. I understand how important it is that for you that this remains under wraps, but from the information that you've given us, this isn't a situation that we can find instant control over. But that's essentially why we're here, because we have the correct answers, not necessarily always the best or happiest answers. And in terms of how this affects you and how this affects your practice, there's a couple of things you'd probably need to know about it. The first one is between your relationship with your client Sammy and how the photo affects that.
The other thing as well is obviously once information comes to light in terms of who took the photo and how they took it, it also perhaps becomes a lot more relevant in terms of we can find out information as to how relevant that photo can be in terms of doing any damage to you, i.e. whether it can be used in evidence against you and all of those sorts of things. But as my colleague has said, this is all very up in the air and it's difficult to guarantee anything at this particular point in time until we get that information.
Okay. So in terms of your relationship with your client, what's important to realise there is that might actually have a serious impact on your ability to continue to represent that client. It creates a conflict between the two of you because you now have a personal interest in his case because there is a personal outcome for you whether or not you win or lose that case. So under the Law of Society rules, that's the sort of situation where we would advise you to recuse yourself. And obviously there's ramifications from that. And so what our position here now is we're going to give you a range of options. And it is always still your choice what you choose to do. But obviously we will often recommend an option as a preferred one over the others. So what we'll do is essentially in terms of Sammy and yourself, what this does is puts you in a position where you're no longer under the rules of client care appropriate to represent him.
But if I don't represent him, and some other person comes in and represents him, I'm in serious trouble if he gets convicted.
And that's why it's obviously very important that you realise these are a list of options of which your choice is to make those. And the reason we recommend that option is because from the scope of the issues we've been talking about, we don't think this is something that can be swept under the carpet or that will go away quickly. So if, for example, you do continue to represent Sammy in this case and the photo still comes out, because with blackmailing cases, there's no guarantee that if you do exactly what they tell you, that they will then follow and not publish that photo. And if they then publish that photo and you continue to represent Sammy, it causes additional trouble for you. So obviously there's not a good option here, but that option is perhaps in the long term better for your interests.
I think in terms of looking at this in perhaps a wider sense, unfortunately the way that the business is operating and in terms of certainly over the last 2 years by the sounds of it, and again we don't necessarily have all the information at hand, but over the last 2 years in terms of the complaints you've alluded to and certainly like the party lifestyle that you have, obviously these things can come to light and this may be something that might bring that to light, but also equally it could be something else further down the track. So in terms of for us to represent you and to help your interests, it's important for us to sort of say like this is potentially a wider problem than just the photograph, and as my colleague is saying, the fact is that by perhaps stepping back away from this case it can mitigate your problems further down the line if they do come to light.
Okay. And obviously you've said this is something that you go out a lot with your clients and that drugs are a part of your lifestyle and it's something that's very frequent in your life. So it wouldn't be sort of fantasy to assume that there's been more than one person with a camera in any of those situations at any time. So while I understand that this particular photo is causing a lot of concern for where we are now, what we're trying to allude is that there is actually a greater risk and that doing exactly what this person says and trying to get Sammy off to the best of your abilities doesn't make that problem of future photos, other issues or other people go away.
In terms of your choices or your options at this point, I think it's only fair for myself and my colleague to be fairly honest and say that it's quite probable that all of these issues, obviously, and you'll be well aware of this, are something that can and will affect your career and potentially get you into quite serious trouble, and you will be well aware of those things. So in terms of our advice, obviously it's perhaps better to treat the wider scope of the problem rather than focus primarily on perhaps a symptom of it, which is obviously this photograph.
So we might wrap up a wee bit now about how to deal with that and move on to some of those wider issues. So in terms of what we would advise you to do, it is your choice, and we can't obviously force you to take any action, that if you decide to continue to represent Sammy, it's in terms of things we would need to tell other people, it's a discretionary disclosure area, so we would keep that secret if you decided to continue to act. But we would recommend that you didn't, because we do see this as a symptom of a wider problem that's going to get worse. What we would recommend you do is that you recuse yourself from the case and explain to Sammy, if you wish to, and we can actually do that on your behalf, we'll be present, explain the basics of you don't need to tell him about necessarily the photo, but we can give him the basic reasons as to why you're no longer able to represent him, and especially helping you in presenting that in a light where it's not because you don't want to represent him or because you don't like him as a client, and make that transition a bit easier, because obviously if you said he's very well connected, that can be a hard thing to say to someone. Is that an option you could possibly consider?
I'm not sure, because even if I do that, what about the photograph? I mean, it might well end up going to, it might well, through Sammy, it may not even been him, or whoever it is that sent the photograph, end up with the police, and if the police get a hold of it, they'll be quite happy to prosecute me, I'm sure.
Essentially, there is no solution where that photo is guaranteed to be destroyed. It's just not an answer that exists.
As my colleague says, it is something that the lifestyle is something that will ultimately leave a trail, and it is something that ultimately, unfortunately, can get you into trouble. And we've got to be honest with you in regards to that these sorts of things do show up, and unfortunately, they will come to light.
So we understand that there are serious consequences, and that's what we'd like to move on to talk about now, because we think that it's not just a case that you've come to us today with this one photo, but that even if that person decides to destroy the photo, there could be other photos, and those complaints from clients all lead to a core problem, which is about how your life and business are being run. And that's definitely somewhere we could offer some advice if you're willing to hear it.
Sure.
Okay. So in terms of the blackmail, we would recommend that you recuse yourself. We can help you with that process so that it's not about you necessarily, but about other circumstances. And what we'd like to talk about now is the way the business is being run, and then perhaps a little bit of information about the drugs and the law and how that interacts.
Okay. So first of all, in terms of running a cash-heavy business, obviously, and you'll be well aware of this, as you've said, that there are certain accounting procedures. So in terms of getting in trouble with the Law Society, it goes beyond perhaps just a photograph in terms of if they go into a full investigation, say worst case scenario the photo came to light, unfortunately they'll look at things like your accounts, they'll look at things like your clients and the complaints they've had. So anything we can do to try and mitigate those would obviously be in, I think, your best interest.
And so in terms of those finances, obviously you might be aware of some of the rules, but I can probably give you a little more detail if you'd like it. But before I do, I just have a quick couple of questions so that I'm making sure I'm giving you the right advice. Do you know if you pay into the Lawyers Indemnity Fund?
Yeah, I'm supposed to, but it's not always, I'm not always up to date.
Okay. And in terms of holding client money, is there any money that you're holding on behalf of clients?
Some, I mean, there's a bit, but I do tend to run through it pretty fast once it comes in.
So essentially, is there money that should be in the account that isn't in the account?
Yes.
That should be essentially belonging to clients?
Yes.
Okay, so we're spending not just the funds that are coming in for fees, but also the trust money?
Yes.
Okay. And obviously, I think it's probably quite clear to all of us that that's a breach of the way that lawyers are required to hold their accounts.
Yeah, but I mean, I'll get the work done eventually.
It's not just about the work. When you're spending clients' money as well, that's not money that was ever due to come in or be paid to you.
Yeah.
So that one, unfortunately, is not necessarily all about doing the work.
Okay.
And also there's a breach of rules there in terms of there's rules about how you have to keep those accounts.